Well, good morning has already been extended. I want to echo that. It's great to see everyone. And if you're visiting here with us this morning, we're particularly honored by your presence and hope that you'll stay around for a little while afterwards so that we can get to know you. We are in the middle of a brief series of lessons on in our sermons right now, and these have to do with praying without ceasing. Based on 1 Thessalonians 5:17, and we've seen that God calls upon us to pray through our tears at times. He wants us to pray through our doubts, even as we talked about last week. And our memory verse last week, coinciding with that, is found in Psalm 73:26, which, if you will read that with me or recite it from your memory, says, "My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever." What a wonderful statement of our faith and of our hope that we have in God. The realization, as all of the songs that we've sung this morning have spoken to the fact that sooner or later there will be difficulties that we face in life, that we're all going to face the crossing of that river, as it were, metaphorically, the river of death. And yet we can do so without the fear of infinite loss or ultimate harm, because God is with us even there, and that He strengthens us and that He guides us through not only this life, but into forever. So today we're going to be talking about just that idea of praying our fears. The things that make us afraid, rather than shutting down our fears, should become the springboard for our fears as we learn to process our fears, our worries, and our anxieties in the presence of God. Fears must not be something that controls us. They ought not to be things that we suppress, but that we learn how to express and process in the presence of God. And Psalm 3 instructs us in how to do this. The situation that is causing David to be afraid in Psalm 3 is identified for us in the preface to the psalm. Not all of the psalms have these, but Psalm 3 is one of those that has a heading that tells us what the occasion was that David is writing about in the context or in the content proper of the psalm. And it says at the heading of Psalm 1 that it's a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. Now you may remember that toward the end of David's reign, after his sin with Bathsheba in regards to Uriah the Hittite, that things began to fall apart for David in many respects. And one of those was the rebellion of his son Absalom, who basically gathered together a coup and raised up, as it were, sort of a fifth column that then subverted and undermined David's reign as king. And he actually marched against the city of Jerusalem, and David had to flee along with his close friends and family away from the city of Jerusalem for a period of time. And so David is running. He's running not just from Saul as he had at the beginning of his kingdom, but now from his own son. And he's running for his life. So it is a fearsome situation. There are, I think, 1 Samuel 15 or 2 Samuel 15 that recounts the story, tells us that there were some 12,000 foot soldiers in pursuit ultimately of David. Now, I know we all have our problems and we have things that can make us afraid, but you've probably never had 12,000 armed soldiers specifically out to get you. I say that we do have some war veterans who perhaps have been in a situation like that and could tell us something about the feeling that comes with the existential threat to your life when you know that you are literally in the enemy's crosshairs. And so that's where David finds himself as he flees from the pursuit of this threat. And you know, fear comes in a couple of different varieties, it seems. At least we could break it down into two major categories, and psychologists and others do this to some extent. But it seems to me that it's proper to say that fear rises up within us in two ways. The first being when we recognize a very specific threat that is coming right at us, particularly a very, very physical threat that's coming our way. And most of the time, if our autonomic systems are functioning properly, it gives us an immediate, I don't know what all the chemicals are, but our brain sees the threat and immediately organs in our bodies release various chemicals, and there's almost an instantaneous response where we are more physically capable and more mentally clear than we normally are. We see the car that's headed for us, and suddenly, we spring into action. Or some people here could no doubt describe events in your life where you saw one of your children, maybe your infant child was falling from a high place, and you're halfway across the room, and ordinarily it would take you quite a while to get there, but without even thinking about it, just instinctually, you see some threat to something that you love, you spring into action, and you're able to catch the child before they fall into harm. And so that is, I think, fear's design by God for us to be able to give us that strength and clarity of thought in order to act decisively when we need to. David's response to the threat that came against him from Absalom and the approaching army was one in which his decisions were swift, decisive, and shrewd. In fact, this afternoon, if you have nothing else to do, reading 1 Samuel 15 is a description of why David was looked to as the tactical leader of men that he was. He made amazing decisions on several fronts in very rapid order to save not only his life, but the lives of those who were with him. But that's not the only kind of fear that you and I experience in life. Maybe sometimes after we've just saved our child from falling and doing great harm or even death to themselves, or we just jumped out of the way of the speeding car. Maybe later in the day, as we calm down from the initial rush of that experience, we begin to reflect on the fragility of our lives. And maybe there's an empty or sinking feeling that we begin to express as we think about how all the things that we tend to hold so dear are actually just seemingly hanging by a thread. And we begin to worry, and we begin to have anxiety, this general sense of dread, this other kind of fear, this sometimes unnamed dread. But it all, I think, is related to the idea of the fear or the realization of how fragile life and the things that we value in this world are. And that kind of anxiety, in contrast to the quickening nature of immediate threats, has sort of a dulling and weakening nature to it, doesn't it? It drains us and empties us and fogs our minds. So David, I think, as he reflects back on the escape for his life from Jerusalem under the threat that Absalom presented, has now time to process that, and he's thinking through not just that moment of fear, but now the larger anxiety that comes in its aftermath. And he does three things in the psalm to work through that. He prays his fears, and I want us to notice the three things that he does. I'm going to give them to you, and then we're going to see them in the text. Number one, he names his fear. He names his fear. He doesn't just allow it to just be this general, undefined thing that is out there, but rather he thinks about it until he is able to name what it is that he fears. And then secondly, he declares to God who he is to him. He declares who God is to him. And then the third thing that he does is he sees his substitute. I think all of those things will become clear as we work through the passage. So in verses 1 and 2, we see that David names his fear. He names his fear to the Lord. It says, verses 1 and 2, "O Lord, how many are my foes? How many rise up against me?" How many are my foes? How many rise up against me? And I don't think I have it on the screen, but the next verse, verse 2, says, Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. Do you see the two kinds of fear that are working in David's life here? First, there was the clear and present danger of the 12,000 foot soldiers that are coming up to eat up and devour his flesh. And he says, look, Lord, see this. See how many there are who are out to get me. And this, again, is not just some paranoia. This is a real, clear, and present danger that is presenting itself to David. But then also, in the part that I don't have on the screen, verse 2, the anxiety of losing his identity and losing all of the things that perhaps he had put his glory in. They were saying, many of them were saying of his soul, there is no salvation for him, that is for David, in God. David used to be the guy. David used to be our leader. David used to be clearly under the hand of God's blessing. God was clearly with David and for David. But many are saying now, not only are many trying to kill me, but many are saying about me, there is no salvation for David in God. God has forsaken David. He's left him. You know how often it is the case when things are going wrong in our life, when we are under threat and when we are suffering loss, we begin to hear those voices. We hear the many voices saying, there's no salvation for her in God. God's done with that person. The first kind of fear, again, moves us to action, but the second drains us of vitality, of our hope, and of our vision. So having named clearly to God what it is that's provoking him to these feelings of fear and anxiety, he moves to the second step, which is to declare openly to God who God is to him. He's not going to allow the voices of what many are saying. There's no salvation for David in God. Instead of listening to the many voices that are saying this about him, he declares to God who he sees God as being for him, and says in verse 3, you, O Lord, are three things. First, you are a shield about me. You, O Lord, are a shield about me. One commentator on this says that the word about here is important because there's two kinds of shields. There's the kind of small shield that a soldier might use to fight behind, and you put up your defense and then you come around to make your attack, and we're all familiar with that. But that's not a shield that is around you. Here is a shield that is larger than that, and one that is designed primarily to cover the entirety of the person in a army that is besieging a city, that is trying to conquer the gates, the walls of a city. It's moving forward, and its shield is all above and around the person so that the boiling oil and the rocks that are hurled down and the arrows that are shot from on top of the tower, the person cannot be harmed by these things. And the description here is the Lord is a shield about him. That's how David sees this. But that kind of shield will only work as long as you are remaining in your place, as long as you are advancing on the enemy. That's the way that shield and that shield wall is designed to work effectively. And so as David remains in this place, continues to try to be what God has called him to be, he knows that God's protection remains with him. Now, it's really important for us to get this next point straight. David does not say, because God is a shield about me, he will never let anything painful, difficult, or sorrowful happen to me. That's not what he's saying. Obviously, that's not what he's saying. A very sorrowful, painful, and difficult thing has already happened to David, is going on in David's life at the time that he says, "But you, O Lord, are a shield about me." That's who you are to me, a shield about me. So he's not saying you will not let anything difficult or painful happen to me, but rather he is saying that as I pass through these shadowy valleys, you're right there with me. And the harm that is meant for me through the slings and the arrows that are hurled my way, these things will not bring into my life the infinite ruin that the forces of darkness have in mind for them to bring about. So God is closer as a shield around him than the taunts of his enemies and the arrows that they hurl at him. We see this not only in the life of David, but over and over and over in characters in Scripture. Think of Joseph and all of the things that were done to him, the sorrowful and woeful experiences that he endured, yet at the end of it all, he was able to say, God was with me through every step of the way, and though they meant it for harm, meant it for evil, God was there with me and brought good out of it. Good for me and even good for others. Think of Job and the things that he suffered and the things that he endured. It didn't mean that God being a shield to Job doesn't mean that Job doesn't suffer, but it does mean that God does not forsake Job in the suffering. It means that Job is able to come through the suffering with a deeper understanding of his own identity and a deeper understanding of his reliance upon God, and his relationship with God is ultimately strengthened through the trial, and he comes through it more than he was before. You can think of the Apostle Paul, who had the thorn in the flesh, suffering, pain, disappointment that he endured, and yet the enemy brought that to him to try to destroy Paul. But God used the very thing that the enemy meant to destroy him in order to purify him, to make him more. And that God's strength and power and glory could be seen in Paul's weakness. So I think that we certainly do not need to think that being a Christian means, being under the protection of God means that nothing painful or harmful or difficult will come into my life. If that's what you think God's job is for you, you may as well just go ahead and become an atheist agnostic this morning and get it over with, because sooner or later you're going to have painful, difficult things to happen in your life. And if that's who you think God is going to be for you, then you're going to be disappointed, dismayed. But if we understand that that's not what God is promising here, but that the infinite loss, the real intent that the malicious arrows of darkness are intended to accomplish against us, that as long as we are moving forward in the will of God, there is a protection about our hearts, and those arrows will never find their way ultimately to our ruin. And so he says, you are a shield about me. I've lost so much. I'm going through so many difficult things, but Lord, you are with me. I don't care what the many are saying, that there's no salvation for David in God. You are a shield about me. I have not been struck through the liver with the arrows of the enemy to the depths of my being. And you are, secondly, my glory. You are my glory. Literally, glory means weight. There's references in Scripture to some hefty people that are described as glorious people. That doesn't mean that they were radiant or beautiful. It just means that they were thick, okay? They were heavy people. That's what the literal meaning of the word glory is something that's heavy. And so metaphorically, it means significant. It means honor. It means evidence of my worth or value. That's my glory. And so it's not hard to think about David's situation here and ask what sort of things might have been occupying that place in his life up to this point. what things did David look at and say, there's my glory? This is the thing that makes me matter. This is the thing that gives me significance. This is what gives me gravitas or weight or heaviness or significance. Well, we could say that he looked around and said, I'm a father of many children. I'm a good father. One of David's sons has, in fact, Absalom, who's trying to kill him now, has already killed one of his other sons because that other son had sexually assaulted one of his daughters. He's so lost the respect of his children that this kind of thing is going on within his household, and his own son has turned against him and is trying to kill him in order to take the kingdom from him. Family is a blessing. Family is a good thing, but if all of your glory rests in your family, no wonder you're filled with anxiety and worry, because this is something that could so easily be taken from us. Well, David could say, yeah, but I'm a great king. Not anymore, not at this point. You're a king running for your life. Well, I have the respect of my men, my army. These men would follow me anywhere. Well, so many of them have now turned against you and are now seeking your life. All of the things that David could look at externally and say, there's my glory. He's lost his power, his influence, his wealth, his status. His earthly glory has faded. And so the question for you and I this morning is, where do we place our glory? Where do we find our significance? Where do we say, I matter because of my skill, my beauty, my career? All of these things that fade and die and are vulnerable. And so fear and anxiety becomes that nagging realization that we may lose them. And so we worry and strive to protect them. And yet, the worry never goes away because our glory is attached to things that are finite, that are subject to loss and decay. And so David, in this situation, is forced to relocate his glory in the one thing that is eternal, and that is God and God's love for him. You're a shield about me. I'm going through this. The arrows are hitting me, but they're not getting to my heart because you are a shield about me. And I've abandoned all the things that I looked to for glory, and I'm seeing now, Father, that you are my glory. And you are therefore the lifter of my head. Undoubtedly, as David was departing the city of Jerusalem and he was being taunted by many who had gathered to see him fleeing for his life, no doubt his head and countenance fell low. But to have someone come along who takes hold of your head or puts their hand on your chin and lifts up your fallen countenance and looks into your face and says, I love you. I value you. I see your worth. And even perhaps in spite of all of your failures, I'm still proud of you. I think David is saying it was great when the young women in Israel were singing and dancing their songs and saying, Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. That was great. But nothing compares with the face of God turned toward me with approval and in love. I failed as a father, I failed as a friend, I failed as a king. But the knowledge that you still want me, that lifts up my head. But the question that really becomes the dramatic point of this psalm is, how does David know that? I mean, after all, this is him saying, this is who you are to me, God. You are a shield about me. You are my glory. You are the lifter of my head. But many are saying there is no salvation for David in God. How does David know that he's right and the many are wrong? I think verse 4 is the answer. He says here, I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. The holy hill is a reference in Scripture many times to Mount Zion, the highest place in the city of Jerusalem, which is a city on a hill, where the tabernacle stood at the time of David, where sacrifices were offered for sin. And that's how someone who, as flawed and with as many failures in his record as David, could still cry out to God in the hope that God could somehow forgive him. And so this is where he sees his substitute, which was the essential idea of bringing a sacrifice of an animal, an innocent animal whose life would be forfeit in place of yours, who would bear the penalty of your sin on the altar as it was given in your place, and you could be received before God. And so there's that, but there's even more. In Genesis 15 and verse 1, we see the story of Abraham as he is come into the land of Canaan. And God's made him these great promises, but he's surrounded by enemies. He has no offspring. And he's wondering how in the world God is ever going to keep all of his promises to him. And I notice that in Psalm 3, David uses much of the same language that is found in Genesis 15. And the connections are, to me, too great to be ignored, that certainly this must have been something that was at work in the mind of David. It says in Genesis 15:1 that after this, the word of the Lord came to Abram and all his doubts and his worries, his anxieties and his fears. And God says to him, do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield and your very great reward. It reminds me of what is said of David in verse 1. I am your shield and your glory. And then in verse 8, Abraham asks again, how can I know, Lord, that these things that you've promised, this protection, this care, and the fulfillment of all the good things that you've promised to me and my offspring, how can I know that these things are going to happen? And here's how this relates to David crying out and hearing an answer from God on his holy hill. What God tells Abraham to do is to take a variety of sacrificial animals and split them in half and arrange them on the ground opposite each other. And Abraham immediately knows what this means. This means that God is going to call upon Abraham to make a self-maledictory oath. In other words, he is going to say, I'm promising God to do certain things, and if I don't do them, then this is what's going to happen to me. I'm going to be split, torn up, and left out for the birds of prey to devour. But to Abraham's amazement, after having arranged these two columns of split animals, a deep darkness comes down, and the Lord comes down and appears to him as a smoking furnace and passes himself between the pieces. And basically it means that God is saying to Abraham, I will fulfill my promises to you even if I have to die to do it. Now, David knew this story. And David prays using the same language. I will not fear, for you are my shield, you are my glory, you are my great reward. But how could David say, you are my shield and reward and my glory and lifter of my head? Well, David did know these things from Genesis 15 and from the sacrificial system, but what David didn't know and what we do know is how God would work all of this out. And so we stand in even a better position than either Abraham or David, because 1,000 years after David, Jesus came down on Calvary's Hill and in deep darkness was cut off from the land of the living. And to the degree that you and I anchor our glory and find our self-worth in the knowledge of God's love for us revealed in that moment, then to that degree, we will become impervious to the debilitating kind of fear and anxiety that cripples many. That's how David found in prayer freedom from his fear. It says in verses 5 and 6, I lay down and sleep. I awake again because the Lord sustains me. I will not fear, though tens of thousands assail me on every side. To lay down and to sleep serenely in circumstances like David was facing, imagine that. Imagine the peace that we spoke of earlier this morning, a peace that passes all understanding, a peace that can only come from anchoring our glory in the Lord and having our hope secure in Him. That will enable us, with all of life's trials and all of its disappointments and discouragements and all of its hardships, to not be moved. I will not fear, no matter what is happening around me, for you are my shield, you are my glory, you're the lifter of my head. If this morning that hope resonates with you and you need the prayers of the church, or you want to come to Christ where all of these answers and hopes are fulfilled, we are here this morning to extend to you that invitation. You can come and you could put Christ on in baptism if you've never done that, and leave here knowing that God is a shield about you. If we can help you in that regard, let us know while we stand and while we sing.